major in finance and econ. And for me, when I was leaving school, looking for opportunities of what I wanted to do next, I saw technology and finance, really the two areas that were passion areas for me, converging in this new space around crypto and DLT. So I chose to go to an organization that was investing heavily in cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, and that was IBM. And there really got to see what a lot of organizations across the globe were doing, back in 2015, 16, looking at DLT, things like CBDCs, supply chain, and more. But for me, it was pretty clear from the jump that where the most exciting innovation was going to be in the public network space. So after, I think, a little over two years with IBM, I got approached by Hedera to join as their director of product and really lead the launch of the Hedera public cryptocurrency network. So for us at Hedera, we really had dual tasks. One was to build and launch that network, but the other was to start convincing some of the biggest brands in the world that we were a network worth supporting. So we recruited organizations like Google, Boeing, IBM, and others to really serve as governors and stewards of that network as we launched it. So I got that opportunity to really go from white paper to globally operating mainnet very early on, which was quite exciting and something I'm personally quite proud of. And then from there went on to found the Hbar Foundation, which I'm sure we'll talk about briefly, but that's the quick and dirty of it.
Great. Thank you so much for this great introduction. And to go a little bit forward, I would have two questions for you. So first, what actually motivated you to found the Hbar Foundation? And second, what are some of your favorite projects in the ecosystem?
Yeah, so I mentioned when we launched Hedera, we had a focus on recruiting some of those big brands, banks, tech companies, multinational institutions that we did quite well at actually converting and building in Hedera, and one of the few networks to have done so. But what we hadn't focused on at that time was much more public, open, broad-based support for the ecosystem of developers and startups building on Hedera. So I launched the foundation along with my co-founder, Shane, really as a accelerating platform for us to more actively support the community. So we wanted to get more money, more technical support, more marketing support out into the ecosystem for anybody from a developer with a project idea all the way up to some of those big multinational companies to get started building on Hedera. So in terms of favorites, it's always hard, right? There's kind of different stuff that emerges every day as to what's really exciting. Certainly the innovation in DeFi is fascinating when you see stablecoin issuers, derivatives issuers, exchanges all coming to market. There's a number of those that are really exciting. But I'm also really intrigued by what we're seeing from different consumer brands. So we work with Ubisoft quite closely to support their use of cryptocurrency and DLT, and you're seeing it start needing to be included in gaming and what you might otherwise call the metaverse, right? Which is definitely an interesting area of growth as well. So those are two that I think are definitely top of mind of where we're seeing some of the most active development.
Okay, great, thanks. And now, what would you say, what is Hedera's #1 differentiator from other blockchain networks like Ethereum, Solana, or Avalanche?
Yeah, so firstly, I'm a big fan of a lot of those communities. Obviously, Ethereum is one of the things that jump-started this whole industry. Solana, I have a lot of friends that work in that area, and it's always cool to see how well they do things like hackathons. But for Hedera, and that's in the consensus algorithm. So it's not very sexy, right? It's kind of the core inner workings of the machine, if you will. But because we built that right, it's scalable, can support 10,000 transactions per second with a path to more, and truly decentralized, where every node participates in every round of consensus. It's going to allow the ecosystem around Hedera to grow. The sexy hackathons and developer communities that we're really supporting through the foundation to build on a network that's not going to start to see issues as they scale. So other networks you've seen have outages based on their consensus algorithm, slowness, which makes it, kind of unusable in some cases. And our hope is that we can provide, especially for those solutions focused on throughput, performance, and scale, a really easy and accessible developer experience to build on those networks.
Okay, great.
I think someone raised their hand. I don't know if I'm calling on them or you want to, but either way.
If you guys don't mind if I jump in. You mentioned that Hedera is like decentralized as one of its selling points, and the consensus algorithm is something that supports that. A lot of projects, not that I think that Hedera isn't decentralized, but just like as an important thing to note, a lot of projects say that they're decentralized, like Solana will say they're decentralized, but really, if you took down AWS, you wouldn't have the Solana network anymore. So my question would be like, how much work does the Hedera Foundation or the team that's building Hedera have to do to support the computing power that it takes, and how much of it is actually truly distributed?
So I could go down a very deep rabbit hole on this, so I'm going to try and distill it, but pull me out if I go too deep. So let me talk about decentralization in a few ways. So first is the actual consensus algorithm. Hashgraph is what's called a leaderless consensus algorithm, meaning that when nodes vote to approve a transaction, add a block to the chain, if you will, every node is voting on every transaction. That is contrasted with what we call leader-based consensus algorithms, which are what's most notably used in other proof-of-stake networks, where a small group or random node is selected to append the block. So they might have 1,000 nodes, but 10 or even 1 are actually adding the block or approving the transaction. So that's the first issue of decentralization that we see Hashgraph solving. Now, the second is the operational component, right? Where are those nodes living and who operates them? So with the Hedera Governing Council members who are operating the nodes today, as more nodes get added, there's actually a rule that no more than 1 or maybe 2 of them can have either a single data center, a single operator, or any semblance of control. So if AWS goes down, right, would take down most services on the internet, 2 nodes of the Hedera network would be at risk, and the rest would function as normal because they're in different cloud providers, different on-premise incentives or on-premise environments, and truly decentralized. And last but not least, I think, is governance. So I often think that, maybe we should have called the Hedera Governing Council the Hedera DAO, and we might have been a little better at branding. But the Governing Council is essentially a structured DAO. It's decentralized. There's multiple organizations that only have a single vote in influence over the network. It's autonomous. It's the entity that actually results in on-chain governance, changes, transactions, but it's organized. There is a forum for that discussion to happen, but they control the roadmap, they control Hedera's LLC, and anything that gets directed at the network. It's different because it's institutions versus individuals, but that decentralized governing model contrasts a lot of other networks where you often see single labs organizations or small groups of kind of steering advisors who are the ones that actually control everything behind the network.
Cool. Thanks.
But it's an important topic, so I'm glad people are thinking about it, because that's what's going to make this thing succeed or fail in Web3 long term.
I agree, it's a very important topic. Thanks, Ben, for the question. Now heading back to another important question. What is it like to be an integral part of a layer 1 network?
I'm gonna separate my Hedera role and then my foundation role. So when I was at Hedera as director of product, right, that was when I was helping to launch the network. We were really focused on a core group of that single event we called open access. And so that was the, firefighting, midnight hours, product development and launch that, is the all-consuming experience that everybody should have in their career. But it was great because I learned, down to the bare bones, all of the details about Web3, how it gets launched, how it can support these kind of innovative new ideas. But that was, something that was a very distinct, intense experience. What I love now about my new role at the foundation is, partially because we have around $2 billion in value that we're allocating, but it gives me the opportunity to enter most conversations and say, what can we do to help you? We get to talk to innovators, startups, developers, and hear just what they have as an idea for something they want to build and how we can use our resources to help them be successful. And from a mission perspective, nothing's more enjoyable than being able to do that day in and day out.
Okay, thanks. And so you already explained, a lot about your previous work at Hedera Hashgraph and your current work at Hbar Foundation, and how everything actually started to getting built on your side. But how did you really get started, generally speaking, in Web3?
Yeah, so back before I graduated, I actually took a semester off to work for KPMG in their cybersecurity division. And so I worked with kind of big companies to say, how can we secure enterprise information and, do technology more securely? And that was right as Bitcoin, came to the mainstream, in 2012, really. And it was really a shift in thinking about how to build these systems. One model is security through control and privacy, and another model is security through decentralization and pseudonymity. And that's really what piqued my interest. I ended up actually writing my senior thesis on how blockchain can be applicable for operating more efficient financial markets. And from there, it was really off to the races. I knew that that was the area I wanted to be working in, and really sought the opportunity with IBM because I knew they were going to be betting big in the space, and it would be a great place for me to start learning what I could best do to grow along with the industry.
All right, great. I actually really like how you put that, like the security through decentralization and pseudo anonymity. I think that's a good kind of little takeaway that I think everyone can take away from it. Could you, I guess, so I know that there are obviously we're all interested in Web3 and the whole space, but there are some arguments about using kind of like Ben mentioned, a hybrid model. Could you, I guess, touch on that? Why is complete decentralization, in your opinion, better, if you think that?
So let me first fess up. One of the things I was most wrong about since I started working in crypto was whether or not I thought I wanted to call this thing Web3. And primarily because I thought it was a way that people said it's either Web3 or not Web3, a very binary yes or no. When in reality, this is a new, paradigm for building financial markets and technology stacks, but it is not the full stack. You always have an application provider. You might have still a bank. You might have a database for storage of information. You might have a credential system for information. And those are all hybrids of fully decentralized or more permissioned, controlled, and private information. And that's absolutely how these systems should be built. So if there's an option between everything is completely transparent all the time and the transparent stuff integrates into, private things, I'm in the latter. I'd say that's also true because one of the core principles behind Web3 and crypto is this idea of ownership of your own assets, property rights, as we would say back in the econ space. And control of property rights by individuals is a fundamental belief of crypto. And by its nature, that has both a public and a private component. And that's one that personally I'm very supportive of as well. Yeah. And it's not just because I now live out here in Wyoming and everybody loves their property and ranches, which is also true.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It is kind of all about ownership. So then on kind of a little different note, but how do you respond when people say, as I'm sure they do, that crypto is just a fad or this bubble that's going to pop soon, or kind of it's just this one-off?
Yeah, that's not something that's new, right? We saw that early on. People said Bitcoin's just a fad as a global currency. And then Ethereum launched and it said, hey, you can now build these applications. And then people said, oh, that's just ICOs. Those are just a fad, right? And then DeFi started. And then they said, that's just a fad. And then NFTs started. And what you're seeing is that there's such a rapid uptick in all of these different industries that even if one of them ends up being a fad, not efficient, or less valuable, there's so many others that the industry will only continue to grow. I'd also say from my perspective at the foundation, when we look at who's coming to us and saying, how can I build? That's only expanding. More consumer brands, gaming companies, sports teams, banks, countries, across the board, that market is only growing and new entrants are coming because they're seeing the value this can provide for financial systems, for digital identity, for user collectibles, and anything really. And that's what I think is, for me, an easy way to say, clearly some of this might be a fad, but there's legs here and the industry is not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you've been around for a while, so I'm sure you've experienced with more people, there's also just more sophistication in the space and higher quality of projects.
I don't often get called old, which I think that might have been as around a while, but when it's wrapped in the compliment, no, but you're spot on. I mean, again, you see the projects that have failed already, right? But more and more are coming, and even more innovative ideas are thought of every day. And that's what makes the space so dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So fast forward 5 years. I don't know if you thought about that, but what is still around, and kind of what is the state of Web3 crypto? What is the state of the Hbar Foundation, Hedera, Hashgraph, everything?
Short answer, all of the above. I think there's going to be, use cases in financial services, payments, everything. But maybe I'll most describe what I think we'll see, as this, right? If you're launching a business, as I'm sure everybody's had a random startup idea, you go buy a domain name, you buy it maybe through Google, you connect it to a Squarespace website, you stand up your Twitter account, and then I think you're going to also launch your token. And that, I think, is a good descriptor of what we'll see in the next 5 years. Is token issuance or usage is going to be a part of any business that's launched. It's going to be the thing that you receive when you go to a Knicks game and get loyalty points, through their ticketing platform for buying a ticket. It might be the actual asset you use to buy the ticket. And it's going to be so ingrained to many of these consumer experiences that it's almost going to be invisible. And that really is one of the great things about the direction the industry is going, is how pervasive it could be, even if it's not always recognized as a crypto thing.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there will still be these institutions or people who are so stubborn that they kind of keep fighting against it?
Yeah, for sure, as there always are. I mean, there's still organizations that don't want to use cloud services, right? So there's always a spectrum of adoption, and people rightly and wrongly opposed to adopting new technologies.
Mm-hmm. So, on a similar note, if you could, going today, what is one thing about the industry that you wish you could change, or you look around and you say I wish this was different?
That's a good question. I think sometimes you see tribalism as the default, where people say, oh, this is Web3 or not Web3, or this protocol or that protocol. That can kind of lead to some bad juju, right? Bad behavior. So that's one, but I really I'm sure many of you all, read stuff from Balaji Srinivasan or listen to his podcast, but one of the things he said once, which has always resonated with me about the industry, is that what makes it unique is that it's focused on this idea of win and help win, right? You can succeed yourself, you can launch your own project, you can be successful with your token, but it doesn't have to be at the expense of the rest of the community. So you can both win for yourself and help the rest of the community win. And so that's the ethos I'd always encourage people to bring to the crypto and Web3 space, because that's what makes it so great, is that it truly is kind of collective, as well as, a free market idea.
Mhm. And on that note, I like this kind of ties into the tribalism as well. I like that some people label like the like Ethereum like Hedera, like Avalanche, Solana, they're like the Ethereum killers. Do
Yeah.
you guys view, I'm sure you don't, given that statement, but like how do you view like people who are just diehard Hedera fans and think all of their networks will like eventually die?
So I always love our community. I always love the ardent supporters, but it's also true that we're going to live in a multi-chain world. And not only that, we should want to live in a multi-chain world. And different networks will support different applications. And that's something that is core to the industry. People are going to freely move between these different networks with their assets to do the things that they think are valuable. You know, maybe they govern their DAO on Ethereum, but process their payments or buy their NFTs on Hedera. That's, I think, a great world, you know, to think about building.
Mhm. And do you think, at least in my experience, kind of going across these networks right now is there's a lot of friction there. So one
Yeah.
thing that definitely needs to happen is the bridges need to improve, and it just needs to become a much better user experience. Is that something that you thought
Oh,
about?
100%. Couldn't agree more. I think bridges, you know, are that connecting point. Wallet infrastructure is another area where it's still early days, right? We're still working about with passphrases and recovery keys, or yeah. Anyways, so there's definitely progress to be made on the user experience side.
Mhm. Ashton?
Hey, I just had a question. I mean, I think it's fairly obvious to say that we're kind of crossing a point where people, you know, have to be recognizing the power of cryptocurrency and Web3. You know, we're seeing Ukraine post on Twitter their wallet addresses and these DAOs being formed, which I think is really cool and really awesome. One thing that I'm interested in hearing is what industry do you think that hasn't been touched yet in terms of Web3, at least not touched a lot, that you think, you know, Web3 has the power to really innovate and change the most, besides DeFi at least?
Yeah. So, firstly, there's honestly not an industry it hasn't touched. You know, in my experience back to IBM through now, I can guarantee you that I've talked to a company, you know, building missiles, building social media platforms, payment systems. Everybody has explored this in some way. That being said, I think the one that we're going to see the most growth in this coming year is really going to be consumer brands. I think that whether you're a sports team or an artist or a music venue, you're seeing cryptocurrency as a great way to build and engage community, which hasn't previously been possible. And so, you know, I gave that example of getting a loyalty point for buying a ticket to a sports game. You're going to be doing that with crypto as the back end. I predict in the next year. And those consumer brands, those communities that already exist today, are really going to see this technology as a way for them to govern themselves, to engage with the people they support, teams, artists, athletes, and get rewarded for their participation, because it's one of the most efficient ways, you know, to build, engage, and incentivize those types of communities.
So
Thank you.
on that, on that note, what is the process for like a legacy company, like maybe a sports team, to get involved with this? Is that where you would fit in the Hbar Foundation? They would approach you and you'd help them get started, on-ramp them and everything?
Exactly right. So our organization, when we talk with, say, a sports team, right, would first get a sense for where they are. Do they know about crypto? Do they have a use case? Do they have an existing partnership? And then help route them to those parties that can most help them. Maybe it's a platform for issuing a collectible as an NFT. Maybe it's a loyalty points platform so they can build a new fan loyalty point, and then provide the funding that can help accelerate their usage of that. And that's what we do day in and day out, again, with large and small organizations to help them be successful.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And like sort of like on like now the smaller project, very new project is approaching you. What's some advice you would give to how you like separate like the noise from the signal? Like, how do you like kind of cut through? There's this huge technical white paper. How do you sort of make that decision?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And that's where we want to get really good at that judgment. And so we look at things when supporting a project, who is the team? And it's not like, are they, repeat startups and, have sold businesses, all of that. It's more, are they, mission aligned? Are they motivated? Do they have the skill set? Do they have the willingness to learn, iterate, and build? And then from there, we'll look more at the business model, right? How is this application going to use crypto? How is it going to add value to our ecosystem? How does a token actually, create value in this as well? I think one of the things that was greatest about this industry since its inception, with Bitcoin, is it's the industry of like calling your shots, right? Saying, here's my white paper and this is what I'm going to do. And then here is my code. This is what I've done and I'm going to deploy. And then say, here's how you can integrate with my smart contracts. And you can verify it at each step of the way so that the projects that are really meaningfully contributing and going to be successful can be transparent in that. And it doesn't even become a question of whether or not they're legitimate. But of course, there's always still that judgment that you need to be exercising.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of when you say looking at the team, of course, a lot of teams are anonymous with these projects. Does that make a difference to you, or is it more just like kind of communicating with them, whether like online or in person, and kind of just making that decision based on just the overall structure?
It definitely makes a difference, but it does not stop our support. The difference it makes, though, is that we need to be comfortable in their identity, even if it's not their personal identity. So what I mean by that is we need to be comfortable that they're a coder. They, can build what they say they're going to build and have done that in the past. They've, launched projects before and not rugged people, right, who were early members, because that is a real risk in the industry, is that, people come anonymous. They say it's because of like regulatory or legal reasons, but really it's a way for them to just get value and then exit. And that's definitely something to be aware of. Again, it's not just say no and walk away, but something that everybody in this industry has to be fully aware of, whether you're investing personally or whether you're an organization like us investing institutionally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes, this makes a lot of sense. Thank you. So we're all here as being, blockchain, crypto, Web3 enthusiasts. I believe that most of us in this room, and generally speaking, in Cornell blockchain, are going to start their career either working in companies or building their own companies. So, what would be 3 pieces of advice that you'd give to people who want to enter Web3 today, whether by creating their own company or just starting to work in the space?
So the first piece of advice, I think, is mission, or find mission alignment. What makes this space so great is that people are working to solve problems that they believe to their core. They want to build open financial markets. They want to build self-sovereign identity controlled by individuals, not by governments. They want to build, more frictionless ways to share and trade data. Finding that problem that you can't not solve will make everything else you do in your career easier. For me, that's the most important question anytime I've looked at a new role or new opportunity, is what is the problem I'm going to be solving, and am I aligned to the mission of solving that problem? The second is you've got to be open to learning as aggressively as you can. Earlier, I talked about white papers. The beauty of this space is there's no end to the information you consume about new innovations. And although that can be daunting, it's also something that you need to embrace to be ready to work in crypto, because it moves so quickly. You need to know about how people are looking to decentralize application layers. You need to know the core fundamentals of public key cryptography and be willing to learn about new innovations that emerge. But last but not least, I think is always important, to be humble, right? Recognize when you don't know something and need to ask for help, because another great thing about this community is there's always those open source forums, Discord communities, Telegrams to ask questions. and be willing to also recognize, if you're launching your own project, for example, when you might need to pivot. Because one of the defining factors of this industry is how quickly it moves. And I can guarantee you, between the time in which you think of a product and launch a product, 110 things have changed, and you need to be ready to change with it.
I agree. Ben, go ahead.
Yeah. So I had a question about, so Hbar is EVM compatible, or an EVM chain, which basically means you can compile Solidity and run your code in Solidity on it. Why did you guys choose to go with EVM compatibility when you're, well, I guess it's not entirely clear like what you're specifically building for, but obviously you're backed by a lot of like big institutions. Those institutions are going to be building robust systems to handle their finances and whatnot. Why did you go EVM when something like Rust or maybe building your own native, language might have made more sense from like a, infrastructure security standpoint?
Yeah, so I'd separate Solidity or smart contract programming languages from broader programming languages. So let me talk about both in the context of Hedera. From a smart contract perspective, Solidity is actually one of the most well adopted and supported smart contracting languages in the crypto space. There's a network of tools, integrations, audit firms, open source contracts, existing developers, training programs that we want to be a part of versus separate from. When you have smart contracts in, Teal or Cadence or Rust, you immediately put a barrier to entry into your community that can actually, prevent its growth, and can also in some cases be inefficient and lead to security issues with new and novel programming languages. But that being said, the smart contract is only a piece of the broader programming stack. And so you have, in Hedera's case, SDKs in Java, JavaScript, Golang. I think there's even a Rust SDK out there as well, a .NET SDK. Because from our perspective, we just want to make the developer experience as easy and accessible as possible. And so align to what is the most adopted industry standard for smart contracts and enable programming in these other languages so that the developer community can be as all-encompassing as possible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Also, to nerd out for a second, when Hedera updated to the latest version of Hyperledger Bisu for EVM smart contracts, they also invented a novel file storage and management system, which actually makes it like 10 times more efficient than Ethereum. So if you want to geek out on smart contract stuff, there's also some cool stuff to see there.
Yeah, I mean, I was mainly curious about just from security standpoint. You would figure that other languages with some smarter compilers offer a little bit more security off the rip in the case of like something like Rust. But I guess from what you've said, it makes a lot of sense why you guys went with Solidity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think there's also differences between the types of audit capabilities and compiling tools that you see between just generic Rust development and something like smart contract specific Rust development. And in the case of smart contracts, a far more robust community and set of tooling exists, and security standards exist in the case of Solidity.
Very interesting. Thanks, Ben, for your question. We've spoken about many interesting companies in the space, many interesting projects and milestones. And I'm sure when you arrived in the space, we're looking after some great achievements, after some people. So out of all of these amazing figures that we have today, who would be your favorite, if not favorite, perhaps top 2, top 3 favorite Web3 influencers, and why?
I'm a big fan of Balaji Srinivasan, most notably because he's focused on pushing the frontiers of crypto into new places, emerging economies, developing world technology, but also, core political issues and existential issues about, in my case, the United States, and really upscaling how we think about what we're doing as an industry in the context of those much broader issues. So he's definitely a favorite of mine, partially because I'm, like I said, an econ nerd and I like to think about that type of stuff. But there's all kinds of great, people doing cool, learnings about technology side as well. I mean, it's hard also not to love how Vitalik approaches the community, right? And how open he is to kind of sharing ideas, innovation, and iteration on those ideas.
Yes, I agree. Talking about Vitalik, what do you think about Ethereum 2.0?
I want it to be very successful. That's about the end of it. It's hard because speaking of being humble, it's one of those areas where I don't profess to know kind of the latest and greatest of how things are going with that rollout. Friends I have who are working more actively on it, I know are hard at that launch stage, right? That is kind of tough for everybody, but it represents an opportunity for what is one of the mainstays in our industry to become, like I said, more performant, more efficient, more sustainable, and more accessible. And that's what this is all about. So I'm very hopeful that it's, very successful.
Great, thanks. So now on another note, why should projects be built on the Hedera network? You have already talked about many interesting aspects about Hedera. Why do you believe that projects should really be built on it? I mean, compared to other competitors.
Yeah, so I think you can separate that into technology, governance, and ecosystem considerations. From a technology perspective, it's fast. You can have 10,000 atomic transactions per second with finality in 4 seconds, which can support payments, DeFi, NFTs, and above. Transaction fees are a fraction of a penny. The energy consumption is less than the energy consumption of Visa. And as we were discussing earlier, you can build in Solidity. You can almost copy and paste a smart contract from Ethereum to deploy to Hedera. There's also that sound decentralized consensus model. So you're not going to see your application, freeze with transactions or have to restart the network because of a consensus issue, down the line. We also have that governing body of institutions who helps to ensure the network is governed in an open and accessible way where more features can be added over time and improved. And last but not least, our ecosystem is one that's most aggressively focused on growth. So you'll be able to talk to banks, to sports teams, to media companies, to tech companies, and say, how can you help me scale my startup, my DApp, and do so in a way that brings the mainstream, brings retail, brings consumers to crypto and DeFi, which is something we're all excited about.
Yeah, of course. I totally agree about this. Alexander, you have a question?
Yeah, hi, Don. I'm glad you were just talking a little bit about the governance. I was hoping you could go a little bit more in depth about that. I see there's 39 council members. I'm curious a little bit about how council members get added, how proposals go through, maybe what are some recent proposals that did go through or did not.
Yeah, for sure. So the governing council is 39 seats, but rotational members. So no organization is going to serve more than 3 or 6 years on the council, which means that more and more teams can actually serve in that role. So not only that, although today it's heavily focused on big brand names, in the future and right now, we're adding more Web3 native communities. Chainlink is a governing member. We might in the future add a DAO. There's organizations that are smaller startups or smaller tech companies that will be on the council, so that it's truly decentralized and representative of a broad set of interests. Now, decisions, most importantly around things like the technology roadmap, are all done in the open and both fed and influenced by the community. So Hedera improvement proposals, like for instance, the update to the smart contract service I talked about earlier, is actually something that gets proposed, for instance, by a third party, upvoted or supported by those third parties, and then ratified by the council, but done in an open way. So those roadmap items are a great example of those types of decisions being executed on the council and them having an impact. It's also led to some good efficiency from a network improvement perspective. So we talk about, the multi-year rollout of ETH2, for instance. At Hedera, we were able to add 3 new services even just since the public network launch, all in a decentralized and open way, which means the network can continue to innovate, because if one thing's true about technology, innovation's always around the corner, and you got to be able to incorporate those types of changes to keep growing.
Very cool. Thanks, Don.
Mhm.
Okay, great. Does anybody else have some questions to ask?
I actually have
Uh-oh.
another question. Speaking, so you kind of briefly mentioned sustainability. I personally am very interested with like integrating Web through sustainability, especially because there's a lot of critiques. It's one of the most common critiques, I believe, is that it's like bad for the environment, not sustainable. Do you have any kind of thoughts around that area?
Yeah, so I'll give you all some not really alpha leaks. Tomorrow morning, we'll be publishing one of our kind of white papers, if you will, a blog post outlining our strategy for 2022. Our goal, for instance, is to allocate about $500 million into the market, and it's focused around 4 areas: DeFi, the metaverse, fintech, and sustainability. So sustainability is actually one of our top areas of focus as a team in 2 ways. One, the network itself is sustainable. You're not going to have a massive carbon footprint by issuing your NFT on Hedera. But that's not enough. We actually see the market of sustainability assets as an incredibly high growth area for DLT, for crypto, and for the economy. So we're seeing projects that are issuing carbon credits, for instance, as tokens on the Hedera network. A company called Dovu is doing that. Once you have an asset representing a renewable energy credit, a carbon offset, or any type of sustainability asset, what you can start to do is build financial markets around the trading of those assets, trading of offsets between institutions to meet their ESG goals, right, to lower their carbon footprint. If you can build financial markets around these assets, you can start to price these assets. You can actually price carbon efficiently at a global level. That opens the door for a whole host of sustainability focused solutions to now benefit from the markets building on crypto and the assets being issued with tokens to achieve, like I said, multinational carbon offsetting goals, or even just individual offsetting goals. And we think that not only is an important industry to enable, but one that is rapidly growing in this coming year, and we see on Hedera as well.
That's great. I'm glad I asked that then.
Yeah, no, it's a really cool space. You see these conferences like COP22 and say, what next, right? Everybody met in Scotland. But it's a lot of these startups, like Dovu, that are starting to issue these assets, build these financial markets so that carbon offsetting goals, for instance, can actually be achieved, which hasn't really been something I'd say the world's had momentum on recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think that like governments or like really large institutions are aware of the benefits that like the distributed ledgers and this technology can provide? Like, are they looking into that?
100%. Électricité de France, the kind of national energy infrastructure in France, is a governing council member of Hedera. They're definitely aware of crypto and DLT. You look at companies like Avery Dennison across the supply chain space. I know them for the little name tags that say, hello, my name is, but they make RFID chips in like every shipping container in the world. These organizations are absolutely looking at crypto, DLT, and Hedera and saying, how can we benefit and build our ESG solutions on this technology?
Awesome.
Sorry if there's a siren.
I guess, I can keep like throwing questions at you. If there's anyone else, we don't really have any more like kind of planned questions. Anyone else wants to jump in?
I actually will interact again, and I have another question. It's funny you mentioned the idea about EDF, Électricité de France, because I'm French, and I wasn't aware about this. But what I'm aware about is the fact that blockchain, crypto, and generally speaking, Web3 is starting to become much bigger now in France and in Europe in a broader way. What is interesting, and I have a question about this, is I literally in the past, few months, saw that there was a much bigger traction in adopting blockchain and promoting blockchain solutions for people running for like government and presidents, especially in France. What do you believe about the state of government and generally speaking, people who are running for candidacy, whether it's in the US or whether it's in Europe, in terms of blockchain and Web3 in the upcoming years?
Yeah, let me quickly talk about France, then turn to politics. You can tell by my last name in French, albeit a few generations removed. EDF not only is leading the charge, we also saw another company, Ubisoft, big in the gaming space, working primarily with, a French team there, looking at how to embrace crypto. So definitely a hot area of innovation. I was there last year for one of the Ethereum developer conferences. So it's also a great community that's growing there. But we've definitely seen over the last year the good and bad of crypto entering into mainstream politics. One of my favorite tweets was back when the Biden infrastructure bill, I think in January, got held up based on some crypto crypto language was somebody saying the inmates are running the asylum because we held up the whole thing. But, for, again, good and bad, it's entering into the mainstream focus, even just in the last 24 hours, right, with Janet Yellen calling out crypto as a potential enabler for, Russians to get around sanctions. And I think the tension that exists is really back to that idea we were discussing earlier, which is, this technology, although it's a technology, is really an ideology of how assets can be owned and controlled by individuals as opposed to institutions. And in many cases, that includes government institutions. So there's part of it that's a tension around that core tenet of crypto. But the flip side is that institution after institution, private sector, like we were talking about today, and government are also building and using this technology. They're using USDC for payments, or, we work with Shinhan Bank, one of the oldest banks in Korea. They launched a Korean won-backed stablecoin. So it's also a huge opportunity for many of these organizations to continue to innovate. And my hope is that that opportunity is what really comes to kind of dominate what people associate with crypto, and why, political candidates recognize its importance, because it is an industry, it's an innovation, and it's also kind of a mindset shift that, they can't really ignore.
Yes, I agree. It has become in a very good way, especially in France. I know how things are evolving in the US, but especially in France and in Europe, very important for them, especially knowing, all of the different problems that Europe faced with Web 2, with everything going on the space, with the RGPD rules, Amazon, Facebook, everything that occurred that wasn't well perceived by the government, as well as the fact that they wanted to have their momentum in technology and they haven't done so yet. So they thought that it could be interesting seizing the opportunity in another way. Yeah, thank you for the explanation. It was very clear. Alexander?
So on a bit of a more technical note, I see that Hedera Hashgraph uses a directed acyclic graph as opposed to a blockchain, which is a different variation of a distributed ledger technology. So I was wondering if you could explain some of the core differences and why ultimately you guys chose to go with a DAG instead of blockchain.
Sure. So short answer is it's a more efficient data structure for propagating information across a decentralized network of nodes. To get a little bit more technical, a blockchain, as I'm sure you know, essentially batches transactions into a block, adds that block onto a chain, and then prunes off any branches to that chain, which it determines to be illegitimate. In the context of Hedera, transactions aren't batched, they're what's called atomic, and they're propagated almost simultaneously between nodes. So what actually gets built in that DAG is a more complex tree of data where nodes are not just saying, this is my block, add my block, but they're sharing the current and all past transactions which they're aware of in an asynchronous way. So it ultimately just results in a different data structure that, again, can be more efficient in terms of consensus determination for those decentralized networks.
Very cool. Thank you.
I wish I had my DAG shirt on. I have my open access shirt on, so I'd be able to give you a nice, real-time visual, but you can look it up in the docs too, I'm sure.
Next time.
So actually coming back to the DAG, I know that this is something that Avalanche has also done. In which ways do you differentiate in terms of the consensus model from Avalanche, knowing that they also implemented directed acyclic graphs?
Yeah, so there's one kind of big difference around the leader-based system for consensus. I talked about that earlier, how that can introduce risk. But there's also this concept in distributed systems of sharding, which is, do you have one network of nodes, or are those nodes broken into multiple subnetworks or shards? Hedera is starting with a single shard and adding shards over time. As more nodes join, the token becomes more widely distributed, and then you can therefore have easy movement of assets between networks and also more secure consensus on each of those shards. Avalanche took the opposite approach, which was to start with a sharded network from day one, where you have tokens over here, contracts over here, and something else, I think, over here. And that can be a challenge from a user experience perspective, from an interoperability perspective, from a developer perspective, and a security perspective. But they're another one of those communities that I think has done a great job of kind of promoting mainstream awareness as well. But I think is very fundamentally different from an architecture perspective.
Okay, thank you. Nick, do you have any other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, one more, like kind of getting away from the technical stuff, but as you work with the foundation, like trying to bring projects on, do you ever do it? Is it ever done actively? Like you see a project, maybe a different network, and you're like, this would be a great fit. Let me reach out. Or yeah, so yeah.
100%. Yeah, we call that inbound versus outbound, right? Inbound is people come to us and say, I want to deploy here. We support that. And then we also do what's called outbound, where we go out to a project, a company, and say, we think you'd be a good fit to build on Hedera. So you'll see some of those blue chips coming soon to the ecosystem. And we think that's going to be really exciting as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh. Or?
Yeah. Hey, thank you. Do you have a plan to do a bridge between Ethereum or Bitcoin to Hedera, like some way to transfer the money?
Yeah, so first, we've actually already got one, but let me make sure I disclaim that we is the ecosystem and not us, because we support the ecosystem. So Hashport is a bridge between Ethereum, Polygon, and Hedera. We're seeing a few others that are going to be coming to market in the coming months as well. And that's definitely an important part of our ecosystem to help enable those connection points.
All right, great. We had one question more on, I know this is you, Don, but on the, I just got a bunch of messages from people in the Zoom who signed up for the airdrop. Do you know if it has to be a MetaMask address, or people are asking if it can just be an Ethereum address?
I don't know, Lena, maybe you can answer, but I believe it's got to be a Hedera wallet.
Okay.
If it's what I think it is, but I honestly don't know. Maybe I know we've only got 3 minutes. I'll just do a shameless plug. We obviously as a team want to support any projects in the space. So if you've got, a startup idea and you want technical support, funding, marketing support to help build it on Hedera or launch it, would love to talk to you. We're also hiring, across our business development team who's doing the deal making, our marketing team, and a few other areas as well. So if you're also still thinking about what you want to be doing next, I dropped my email in the chat here. So, please reach out and we'd love to connect.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Don, for joining, taking the time. It was awesome. Thank you to everyone who came as well.
Of course. Yeah, no, thank you all for coming. Enjoyed the questions, enjoyed the conversation, and good luck to you all in your next adventures as well.
Thank you.
Very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nick, actually, Lena just told me. Hey, Lena, can you hear us? Yeah, she just told me that she will reach out email sorry, for if the wallets aren't right, because it might be gift cards. I don't know if she told you as well.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna stop recording.